Hours after the two-week ceasefire aimed at halting the US-Iran conflict was announced, the reality on the ground collapsed. Lebanon instead witnessed one of the deadliest escalations since 1982. 254 people were killed and more than 1,000 civilians injured, and even a journalist among the victims. What was presented as a diplomatic breakthrough is now looking increasingly like a fragile ceasefire, built on a deep misunderstanding of its terms. Washington says Lebanon is not included. Benjamin Netanyahu makes it clear strikes will continue, while Tehran insists otherwise and warns the agreement itself is already at risk. Let's see another escalation. After brief activity, the Strait of Hormuz is now reportedly fully closed. Oil tankers forced to turn back. Tehran citing violations of three key clauses, as stated by Mohammad Baghir Kalibaf, even before negotiations begin. And in the middle of it all, Pakistan stepping in to mediate, with China watching closely while every side and everyone else involved seems to be interpreting not just the agreement, but reality itself in completely different ways. We talk about this and more with our guests after the jingle. So Lebanon continues to burn under relentless Israeli strikes, killing at least 254 civilians and wounded hundreds more in one of the deadliest bombardments since hostilities began. Washington has made it clear that Lebanon is not included in the ceasefire agreement with Iran, even as Tehran says continued attacks undermine the deal's terms. Nabil Khazini has more details.
It is between a ceasefire and a crossfire that stands Lebanon. Here the pause that many hoped for is not felt, and therefore Lebanon continues to bear the brunt of Zionist strikes. A reminder that the ceasefire is far from being regional. And tonight, Washington left no room for doubt. The truce does not extend to Lebanon.
I think the Iranians thought that the ceasefire included Lebanon, and it just didn't. We never made that promise. We never indicated that was going to be the case. What we said is that the ceasefire would be focused on Iran and the ceasefire would be focused on America's allies.
But in Iran, the story is quite different. Iran's parliamentary speaker has claimed that three clauses of the ceasefire framework were broken even before talks began, most notably the pledge to halt strikes in Lebanon, a cornerstone of Iran's 10-point peace proposal. Just hours after Washington and Tehran announced a tentative two-week ceasefire, Zionist forces unleashed a devastating aerial barrage over Beirut, the heaviest since the fighting began, killing over 250 civilians and wounding hundreds more. For survivors like Naim, peace remains a distant hope amid the rubble.
We are living in a nightmare, so I'm afraid today to sleep. So maybe it will happen this the second time. Who's gonna, I don't know. But I will pray and then sleep. That's it.
With lives and a constant threat across Lebanon, the United Nations denounced the attacks as a huge escalation, warning that the flames of war show no sign of cooling.
I think it would be quite a high level of despair right now that people have seeing what has happened, and if indeed the sense that they have is what it appears, that Lebanon is not part of this.
The ceasefire may hold elsewhere, but here every moment remains uncertain for a nation already scarred by conflict. The question is not if peace will come, but when, and at what cost.
And to discuss this further, I'm joined by a distinguished panel of guests, and starting with Mr. Abdunnoor Toumi, geopolitical analyst. Thank you for being here with us.
Good evening, and thank you for having me on the program.
Our pleasure. We're also joined by Mr. Wasil Bourghul, lecturer of political sciences at the University of Sciences Po Paris and La Nouvelle Sorbonne, joining us via Teams from Paris.
Thank you very much for this invitation, and as usual, I'm looking forward to these conversations.
It's a pleasure to have you also. We're joined by Mr. Yassir Masoud, a geostrategic analyst and political commentator, joining us from Beijing. Thank you for being with us.
A very good morning from Beijing, and thank you very much for having me.
Our pleasure. Let me perhaps start with you, Mr. Toomey. 254 people were killed just in one day by Israel in Lebanon after hours from the agreed ceasefire between the US, Israel, and Iran.
This is, as one would say, it's here we go again. And it's a part of the Zionist entity prime minister. And at any moment when he feels he's cornered, he showed up with committing those atrocities. And what happened today, it's full aggression and a carnage that took place in Beirut. And this was actually the Lebanese and the capital Beirut didn't see that for decades, since the invasion of then another butcher, Sharon, who did invade Lebanon, and the Lebanese since that moment, even before, have been going through this nightmare. But again, the Zionist entity prime minister, he's trying to apply his Gaza doctrine and Hezbollah approach and go in and what, as I mentioned, at the moment when he feels he's cornered, or the US President, Mr. Donald Trump, will take stand position on serious issues like this, he tries to sabotage the trust at this point, because it's not a ceasefire yet, or it's very, very fragile. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 4 hours, which is the entire region now is holding its breath for a tenacious ceasefire.
For a tenacious ceasefire. Mr. Wasil Burghul, do the events in Lebanon just hours after the announcement prove that this ceasefire exists more on paper than on the ground?
Let me first start by saying that every peace under occupation is an illusion. Allow me to start by sharing my sincere condolences with the Lebanese people. This morning, as you mentioned, over 200 civilians, just like you and I, many of whom are children and everyday citizens, each his own life and occupations, woke up only to be severely bombed by large-scale airstrikes that hit dense urban areas and even in central Beirut. You mentioned the death toll, and you mentioned the number of people injured, the fact that the hospitals are now overwhelmed. So my thoughts and prayers go to the Lebanese people. Unfortunately, we tend to have a short memory. I mean, Lebanon has been living and suffering from this aggression since 1948. And just to remind people, this 1948 comes 30 years before Hezbollah was even created. This is a mathematical equation that the Western world does not want to acknowledge. Now, one of my first few memories in life, and perhaps the same applies to many of our viewers today, is I grew up watching the Iraqi people witness exactly what's happening today. Over 100,000 deaths, 2 million displaced, and over 50,000 tons of bombs were dropped on a people that has asked for nothing, all in the name of American interests and protecting national security that was never really threatened by everyday citizens on the other side of the globe. So it's a real shame that 23 years have passed. International relations and intergovernmental bodies have wreaked nothing but havoc over the countries that it vowed to protect. Tony Benn says all wars represent a failure of diplomacy, and I think what we're noticing today is indeed a failure of diplomacy. You mentioned the ceasefire agreement. You mentioned the fact that people had actual hopes that this might be coming to an end. But then again, this morning and just a few hours later, the tragic events that happened in Lebanon proved this wrong. I mean, Israel uses the justification that Lebanon was not part of the ceasefire deal. However, and I was just checking on X, which is previously known as Twitter, I was checking the tweet that was shared last night by Pakistan's prime minister, and indeed Lebanon is mentioned. and it literally says, including Lebanon. So honestly, I find this very hard to believe, and I do not find a justification for what happened today in Lebanon. So I'm really looking forward to the exchange to perhaps see other points of view that I have not yet came to.
Mr. Yasir Masoud, from a mediation standpoint, what does this immediate return to violence point to? We were expecting things to calm down just yesterday night, and in the morning we see that the Israelis chose violence again.
Yes, I think it's a very sad news coming from Israel again, because since yesterday, I think it was a historic moment for Pakistan to broker a peace deal in such a tight situation. I would like to call it as it was no less than walking on eggshells, the way Pakistan has, relied itself as a honest and neutral broker between Iran and United States of America. But as you know, that when it comes to ceasefires, it's a temporary truce, and sometimes there are, spoilers everywhere. And as we know of that, the Zionist policies of Netanyahu have been carried on, and I think he is the real spoiler in this truce. And for me, I'm really shocked because since yesterday, even President Donald Trump thoroughly agreed on the 10 points deal which came from Iran. And I think the Lebanon was mentioned by our Prime Minister of Pakistan, Shehbaz Sharif, and President Donald Trump agreed to it. Then suddenly, now the news is coming from Washington that Lebanon was not included in it, which reflects that it's not only fragile, but there are other intentions, and that could again be horrendous for the regional diplomacy and peace. And I think at this point, Pakistan will, I'm sure that Pakistan will yet again will carry on its efforts for peace and diplomacy, which it has shown to the world since yesterday.
Okay, since yesterday. Mr. Toomey, so basically Trump, Netanyahu are both saying that Lebanon is excluded from the ceasefire because of Hezbollah. So from Lebanon excluded from the deal, has it effectively become the space where the conflict is allowed to continue?
Actually, it's a part of this psychological war, and also world war also in light of the day of these opening talks in Islamabad between the US and the Iranians. And this is, it is important of the dynamic of these talks that will be taking place, I believe, on Friday or Saturday. But again, the main actor in this and who is trying to spoil all this is the Zionist prime minister, because he did that with Gaza, and he did that with Hezbollah agreement in 2024 to this, because he knows that he doesn't have much room now to spoil these talks, because the entire, not only the entire region now that is holding its breath, but the entire world is anxious, and they want, and they are tired. The world wants to break through and go for end this war. But the approach that the Americans and the Iranians are having now, it's a serious chase game, and the Americans are weak in this because they don't have much cards on leverage to push the Iranians, because the Iranians now, they're having actually two cards, the Hezbollah cards and the Hormuz Strait, which is a wild card. So as far as for Hezbollah goes, is now the Iranians are including this in their non-actor state, the access of the resistance as a part of their leverage in the negotiations with this breakthrough for negotiations with the Americans to make an end to this continuous aggression. And the Iranians are reading carefully and attentively or watching the move of the Americans because they don't want to have just a main or a basic ceasefire like we stated for the Gaza and with Hezbollah. They want a serious agreement and engagement from the Americans on one hand, and to corner for good the Zionist entity, particularly this prime minister who wants to continue for, his approach is for endless war and for permanent wars in the region because he cannot himself and his messianic government, racist government, cannot thrive in peace and security and stability because at the end of the day, the Zionist prime minister, Zionist anti-prime minister keeps lecturing the region, calling for peace and security, but he needs security for his people, but he doesn't care about the security and the stability for the region. What he's calling, and when he talks about peace, he doesn't mean peace that rhymes with stability, prosperity, and so on in the region, but he wants capitulation. This is why the Iranians are watching carefully the moves of the Americans because they know they don't want a deal nor capitulation. They want a serious
deal and ceasefire.
Comes for ceasefire, and that will end all this aggression that Iran has went through twice, and the destabilization of the region. And just one last point. And we're speaking about the carnage that took place today in Beirut and the entire Lebanon, but one has to remember also the killing of journalists in Gaza. Having said that, the Zionist entity prime minister, he kept his eyes on Gaza and Beirut, so that in southwest of Syria, all these expansionist vision or strategy. This is why he doesn't want to have permanent peace. So the Iranians are watching him carefully, and they are dealing with the Americans and sending strong message for the U.S. administration, this administration, that doesn't have a solid strategy and knowledge in terms of how to deal with long-term peace and stability, security and prosperity in the region.
Mr. Masoud, we have seen 254 deaths just after, again, the ceasefire was agreed upon by Israel, the US, and Iran. And so how is this going to affect the diplomatic track that is currently still ongoing? Because Friday is supposed to be the day where there will be direct negotiations between the US and Iran for the first time.
Yes, I think this, as I mentioned earlier, this is extremely sad that, it is emanating from the Zionist, the apartheid state against Lebanon. And this is probably one of the most horrendous sort of attack which came from Israel against the innocent people of Lebanon with such a barbaric and lunatic, I would say, attitude. Because you see, now this is the time when the world has to put their acts together, and they need to put their heads together as well. Because right now, the whole stability and security of the world is at stake. And I think the way Pakistan has achieved this milestone, there are states like UAE, for that matter, which is hand in glove with the Zionist policies of the Israel. I think right now there are still efforts going on part of Pakistan, because even yesterday this was probably the last and least window of opportunity on which Pakistan has opened for the United States and as well as for Iran. Because as we know of that, United States wanted an off-ramp, which Pakistan provided to President Donald Trump because of the quagmire of its own making, in which he has dragged himself on the instructions and policies of the Netanyahu. And then it also was a win-win for Iran as well, because they offered a sort of victory for its own people. And President Donald Trump offered a sort of victory for its own domestic consumption. But then again, this is a sort of a war of narratives now at the same time, because if they agreed upon, and which is the whole world knows about it, now getting off from their own words and then backing off from their own words means that it will, of course, it's a big dent on the sort of, diplomatic efforts which Pakistan tried and tested. But I think there is still some time, and let's see. I think it will probably within a day or two, because the Islamabad Accord or Islamabad talks have already been scheduled for 10th of April. If nothing comes, a sort of, a positive news doesn't come out of this, then I think Iran will be pushed to break this ceasefire, and then we can have some sort of aggression again in the region, which will definitely impact the global economic fallout because of the Strait of Hormuz. And right now, because of this Zionist policies of Israel, there are more than 1.5 million people displaced in Iran. There are about 1.2 million people displaced in Lebanon. So for how long this kind of repressive policies will carry on? The world now has to realize that such radicals like Netanyahu and wackos, they are actually creating the, destabilizing the world peace. And I think this is the time where world has to unite and do something about it.
Mr. Burghul, when Washington, Tehran, and Islamabad all described the ceasefire differently, can we really say there is a single agreement? We have seen yesterday, just minutes after the proposed ceasefire, we have seen that the U.S. was saying that the version in English and Farsi are not the same. Then today he's saying that they did not agree on the fact that Lebanon is included in the ceasefire, whereas the ceasefire clearly stated that Lebanon was supposed to be included in the ceasefire.
If this was a translation or an interpretation issue, I think that it's a very serious one, although I highly doubt it. All this talk about the diplomatic efforts and the perhaps steps moving forward towards finding peace, all this quite honestly surprises me. It's because it's as if we're talking about an international scene that is very different from what we've seen going on in the past 10 days. And mentioned the discriminatory Israeli system, and mind what happened in the past 10 days. The US and Israel collectively have violated over 15 articles of human rights conventions. And I can go through them one by one tonight, but I'm sure that we don't have the time. But simply to remind, the death penalty law that was enacted on March 13th, that goes against the Fourth Geneva Convention, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Freedoms, and this simply puts in place a racially discriminatory system because we have a two-tiered judicial system. We know that the Palestinians are the only ones who are being ruled in a military court, whereas the Israeli civilians are the ones being ruled in a civilian court. And so this creates, by definition, an apartheid. The US and the tweet that Trump has launched yesterday, threatening the world to literally end a civilization. This is also something that's very contradictory to everything we know about international relations and the international law. You cannot just launch genocidal threats, let alone if you're the president of the United States. This goes against the Genocide Convention, the 3rd article, which criminalizes direct and public incitement to commit genocide. Israeli bombings in Lebanon as well today. I mean, there was no prior information to the Lebanese people about this bombing. We know that all it took is 10 minutes to bomb over 100 sites. I mean, this is far from international cooperation and far from all of the diplomacy talk that we're trying to have today. I mean, we're talking about the violation and the complete contradiction with the laws that were once made by the countries that today vow to represent diplomacy and to represent international relations and to represent mediation and conflict resolution. I find this very contradictory, and quite honestly, I think the main issue that we're going to see in the next few days is not necessarily linked to the technical points that are mentioned in the ceasefire agreement itself. I think that the problem is much deeper, because I think that there's a rupture in terms of confidence. I find it very, I would say, unlikely that Iran or any other country trusts promises that are made by countries that have in the past 10 days violated over 15 laws that protect the human rights and 15 international laws that they themselves have ratified and agreed to, and do not stop lecturing the world about the necessity of having such laws to maintain democratic rule all over the world. So quite honestly, I think that the biggest issue, as I said, it's not linked to the Strait of Hormuz. It's not linked to any of these technical problems. It's rather linked to a lack of trust.
It's due to a lack of trust. So the problem, Mr. Abdel is deeper than the 10 points ceasefire plan. It's deeper than the opening or the closure of the Strait of Hormuz?
Actually, it is, and all these process or this, again, talks and that will lead to a long-term negotiation between the Americans and the Iranians. It's based on actually on two elements, trust and respect. And this is where it's going to be very tough for both parties to rebuild these two elements, in which the mediator, the Pakistanis, are playing a major role in it. And they have been good in it because they succeeded to some extent to bring the two parties, or at least to narrow their differences and bring them to the negotiation table. And the Pakistanis have this experience that goes to the 70s, and that the role they played between China and the US, and that how they, again, was very important in the shift in international relations in the time of the Cold War. So that today it's pretty much the same in terms of this new balance of power and the shift that the region is going through. Not only the region now, but when we see this, the impact of these 40 days of this illegal war, how the entire world is concerned. And this is why we see actors, regional actors, and pivotal states like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, and the phone call that actually today were two interesting phone calls between the Turkish Foreign Affairs Minister, Mr. Hakan, and his counterpart, the American counterpart, Rubio, and the Pakistani with his counterpart, Saudi Arabia. And it's very important today because we speak about Iran and the US on one hand, and the Zionist entity role in, because all this mess as a result of their interference in and creating this instability in the region. But there is, I can't say they are missing, but they are actually having in a tough position the Gulf countries who have been today actually, as they are playing a major role and their diplomacy is working, like for instance, Qatar and Oman. On one hand, are pushing for these talks and to succeed, but they themselves, they need to be included in these negotiation table, because at the end of the day, we, the people of this region, we are concerned. When we say we, the entire region from Muscat to Nouakchott are concerned, because not only the people, the political elite, the cultural elite, the scientists,
they're responsible.
Everybody, I mean, the business mobilities and so on, because enough is enough. The region has been going through this case for actually the last 25 years following the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003, but going before that to the 80s, and how this, and as a result, the ones who are paying the heavy price are the people. So this is why this Friday and Saturday, or these talks are very important. And this is why, again, one has to have to give credit to the Pakistanis for having this role, to bring these two parties together and trying to be, because they are trustworthy brokers, and also they know the impact of and the consequences of of this war on the entire region.
So we have to give the Pakistanis the credits for mediating in the conflict. Mr. Masoud, Pakistan is currently acting as a bridge between these narratives. Are they facing any limitations? How is it working?
Well, actually, let me tell you first that this wasn't an easy task at all. And as my panelists just mentioned, the historic rapprochement between United States of America and China in 1971, that was also brokered by Pakistan, and one of the finest rapprochement in international relations, which opened the doors for China and as well as for the US. So Pakistanis have done that in the past and has done it yet again. Why? Because if you see in this conflict, Pakistan has played very sagaciously and played its cards very wisely. Not because that Pakistan was taking any side, but the trust which they have built, especially after the major shift which occurred after the May 2025 conflict with India, that has actually uplifted Pakistan's geopolitical profile. And right now, big powers like United States of America, China, and Russia, they see Islamabad as a trusted partner, and Pakistan became neutral in this, despite the fact that we have a pact, a security pact with the Saudi Arabia. But Pakistan time and again convinced the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, not to jump into this war, because that's what actually Netanyahu wanted, so that the whole Gulf states start having a fight with each other, and so that they can be destroyed. And let me also tell you that both United States and Israel has different objectives, poles apart from each other. With this kind of maniacal pursuit of greater Israel, Netanyahu wants to further destabilize the region. On the other hand, United States felt that they are actually in a big quagmire, and there are lots of criticism on President Donald Trump, as well as far as an immense pressure emanating from the people of America against its own president, and then the global fallout because of the closure of Strait of Hormuz, creating ripple effects across the region and across the world. So America wants to have an off-ramp, an exit strategy, which Pakistan provided. But on the other hand, this was already on the cards, because we know that who is the spoiler. But it will happen this way. This was not expected.
It was not expected.
But I think that still there is some time, and I feel that Pakistan will still try its best, because for the successful talks in Islamabad. But I think that to have a sort of a control on aggressive policies of Israel, I think it was the prime responsibility of America, of the president of America by Donald Trump to control Israel. But on the other hand, we see that now the news is coming that they are actually backing up the of this attack, which is very sad. And I think there has to be a broad-based consensus now from the consortium of these regional partners like Saudi Arabia and Oman and Egypt and Turkey, including Pakistan. I think they should approach United States of America again, as well as Iran, to have a restraint and let the diplomacy run its course for the regional and global peace.
Mr. Burghul, with Iran stating that 3 clauses were violated even before the talks resume, that will be on Friday. Does this mean that the ceasefire was fragile from the beginning, or how can we interpret this?
I think, despite everything that has been said, something that probably everyone tonight has mentioned is that we need to acknowledge the important role that Pakistan played behind the scenes in its mediation. Regarding your question about the impact of what happened today, I think, and I'm going to try to discuss a bit the American side of things, because we've had a perspective on the Pakistani side. Last night was a very intense night in Washington. Up until 6 p.m., I think there was mounting stress and tension in the United States. We've seen Bernie Sanders tweeted asking the American people to step in to stop yet another genocide. We already know that the majority of Americans disapprove the military action and how the US is handling it right now. The recent polls show more than 54% of the American people are against this war. And most think that the decision to use force to begin with was wrong and that the conflict isn't going well. So I believe that from the American side, at least, I imagine that the American people were at least happy with this momentarily brief ceasefire. Now, we don't know where this is going, definitely. We don't know the Iranian retaliation. But what we do know for a fact is that the American people's top concern isn't abstract geopolitics. It's the rising gas prices. It's the economic impact. It's their personal safety. It's the mortgages that they spend their whole lives paying. The $50K per year that every student has to pay in tuition. Now, we know that Republicans are more likely than Democrats to support the military action, but even within the party, I think yesterday, and with the deadline coming up, we've seen a lot of fractions within the party itself. So the public is split on whether this war will make the US safer or not. So the fact that we have a ceasefire, despite its flaws, despite what has been going on today, is good news, at least to the American people. But as you mentioned, I mean, we have a lot of variables at stake. We do not yet know Iran's retaliation strategy, but we definitely know that the public opinion today, and this has been shown in the tweet, as I said, shared by the Pakistani Prime Minister. Everyone had the impression that Lebanon was included in this ceasefire. You mentioned that it could have been a translation mistake. Now, I don't know to which extent these news are confirmed, and I think that this detail will be very important in knowing how things will evolve in the next few days.
Mr. Abdenour, to me, we've seen the Pakistani mediation. Does it signal a shift away from Western-led diplomacy towards new actors?
Totally, because again, the West is fair, and the global North is totally absent. Because actually, to some extent, the Europeans
they have welcomed, despite the Europeans actually welcoming the ceasefire.
They did, but they have been incoherent in their process. Actually, before the negotiation that took place in Geneva and Muscat too, the first week or so of when this illegal war broke. But then they started to feel actually the consequences of this war, because this war, one, was expanded globally, and it was the second phase of the war was energy. That where the European, for instance, started to act or react. But again, the Europeans have been weak for the last 2-3 years, even before that, actually, in following the Ukrainian war. And again, the Europeans also want to speak, actually, the UK is not in the EU, but the main EU countries like France, Italy, and Germany have been actually cavaliering alone, because we saw they didn't have that coherent and integral process, because we saw how Italian Prime Minister Ms. Meloni, who has been acting alone, and French President, and even the German Chancellor. But yes, you are right, and we see now this is the mediation or the peace and the calm diplomacy now is incarnated by Pakistan, Turkey also, and China, I mean, who has been very active and playing a major role, and have been playing a crucial role in these troubled waters, and that led to those talks. But Pakistan, again, one has to give them this credit because of its geographical position, and also one has to remember Pakistan is a nuclear power, and it was this war, I mean, these 40 days of war, I mean, everybody was holding his and her breath, actually, because we didn't know what President Donald Trump was going to do. So the role of Pakistan was key in this war, and not only in terms of the peace, but also in the war process. So this is why the wisdom of the Pakistanis did help to break through, and will again bring the two parties, the Iranians and Americans, to the negotiation.
Direct negotiations for the first time.
For the first time, indeed. But one has to be careful, because this table is still fragile, because the Zionist prime minister is still watching it, and he is capable to implode it at any moment.
At any moment. Mr. Burghul, same question. Are we witnessing the rise of middle powers like Pakistan as major mediators in such crises?
I think indeed, even though we know that Pakistan has already had this role in previous conflicts, so we know that the proximity that it has, geographical proximity to Iran and to the conflict zone, makes it a very important player. We know that its power as well, its military presence also gives it the legitimacy to play such a role. And in international relations, we know that the closer we are to a multipolar world, the more we have superpowers, the better it is, because it allows to keep a certain balance of powers instead of having one or two actors that can simply tyrannate and dictate how geopolitics should be based on their own limited interests. So I do believe that Pakistan is indeed stepping closer to this role, but I don't think it's a new position. I think that it has already done this previously, and today it is fully legitimate, and we acknowledge indeed the important role that it played, at least in limiting the escalation.
About still the mediation and talking about China's dimension, perhaps with you, Mr. Masoud, is China indirectly shaping this current mediation through its relationship with Pakistan?
Well, yes, absolutely. And China last week, when Pakistan's Deputy Prime Minister Ishaq Dar visited Beijing, and Beijing officially and categorically backed Pakistan in its tremendous efforts of bringing peace and stability in the region. And this wasn't easy, as I mentioned earlier, because Pakistan has earned this trust and stayed neutral in this conflict. And I think in the Gulf states, if you see, Pakistan was only state under the sun which has actually stood by Iran, even in the difficult times and even having a sort of pressure from some of the proxies of the Israel. But still, Pakistan stood its ground. And when Ishaq Dar visited and met with Mr. Wang Yi, they came up with 5-point peace initiative for this region. Yes. And I think China also knows this as a matter of fact, that now it's a new reality of multipolar world order. And I think regardless of whatever the situation is, two middle powers, I would say Iran and Pakistan, they have emerged as credible partners, both militarily and as well as diplomatically, I would say, that along with Russia and China. So I think Chinese know this as a matter of fact, that there is only way for the peace and prosperity is to have diplomacy and dialogue. And China fully supported Pakistan in this. I think right now, when we talk about this multipolar world order, when it comes to middle powers like Pakistan, they are extremely cautious about its reputation, and as well as they want to make a breakthrough. So right now, let's see what's going to happen. But I think the way Pakistan has played its card, it's commendable. And the way the world leaders are acknowledging and sending laurels to Pakistan's prime minister, this is a testimony of this fact. Let's see that the sanity prevail, especially from, and I would repeat it again, that this is now the responsibility of the United States of America to have a word with Israel, because if they want stability in the region, then it must be controlled, the repressive policies of Israel. Otherwise, we are still in for a sort of a conflict which will definitely have its spillover effects and its implications beyond imagination.
Maybe we have spoken about all of the diplomatic efforts, we've spoken about mediation and everything that is happening at this very specific phase and current situation. Can we say that we're just doing diplomacy, but we're not really resolving the problems at this point?
We are in a crucial moment, and actually the world order now is shaping, and it is under construction, because the previous one has collapsed, and notably the international law, so that the international community, so which is, I mean, that is very weak. So this is why these coming hours and these coming 2 weeks, that these talks between Iran and the US will shape or redesign the world order, because there are now new actors have already emerged, and that will also make an end to the monopoly of the US hegemony, actually not only in the region, but whether in Europe or in South America, because we saw how the US administration foreign policy doctrine, in which like a year ago or before that, actually when Mr. Donald Trump was again calling himself an isolationist, America first, and he will end all the wars. So to the contrary, actually, he he made the entire world unstable. So today is the countries like China now are taking the lead and speaking about the role of Pakistan, which is crucial and very, very decisive at this moment. But what Pakistan is doing is just mediating, but these talks, they need a guarantor coming from a superpower, and this guarantor will be China. So, but back to the core of the problem in the region. So these talks between Iran and the US will, in the future, after they will make a ceasefire agreement between the two countries, but will have that ceasefire will have hopefully positive or a ray of hope of ramification for the entire region, MENA region, and particularly the core of the problem is the Palestinian cause, because one cannot speak today about this instability and this chaos in the region without going and for once and dealing with the Palestinian cause, looking for possibility for a serious peace process and not capitulation. So this is why, again, China can be a trustworthy broker, because we saw how China did play a major role in 2023 for the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and today is positioning itself in this dynamic of this conflict that will lead to calm diplomacy. That's what the new world order will need, and for the peace and security in the world.
To prevail. Mr. Burgol, so maybe the same context, is the region shifting from one battlefield to another under a diplomatic umbrella with just talks?
I mean, quite possibly. A lot of analysts today identify the war that's going on in Iran as a simple proxy war. So I think the war in itself, by definition, even if we're talking about the US and Iran, is already a delocalized war, because beneath it, there are interests of other superpowers, including China and Russia. We know that this presents a good opportunity for Russia to be autonomous and to sell its natural gas with higher prices, knowing that the supply is less and less available. We also know that this as well allows China to perhaps have this cooperation with Russia. And I believe that this war is indeed a proxy war. It is an indirect war with the other superpowers, and this sense or this feeling has also been translated in the American sphere. I mean, I was listening earlier to news broadcasters in the West, and there are indeed, I would say, highly mounting concerns about what happened today may indicate when we think about this war. There's a fear of a new escalation. We know that the Strait of Hormuz is now, I would say, partially open, and we see more and more ships going through. But the American political view is still very nuanced at this point. We do not see a clear pattern. Some are saying that indeed, with Pakistan mediating, this means that we're moving towards a de-escalation. But then with what happened today, these same concerns came back again, saying maybe we should not be that optimistic, even though we have Iran mediating. It can simply mean that the war will be longer and will not necessarily be resolved. So again, I think it's still a very blurry and foggy scene, and in my opinion, it's very hard to make calculations at this point.
At this point, it is very hard to make calculations. Mr. Masoud, we have seen that Iran today, a couple of hours ago, they have said that they closed the Strait of Hormuz in response to the strikes and attacks on Iran. And so we can say that they're using the Strait of Hormuz as a leverage in the negotiations.
Iran has been using Strait of Hormuz for a leverage and for pressure against the Gulf states, and as well as against Israel, and even against United States of America, so that they can reach to a sort of a logical conclusion. Let me tell you, before coming to your response, that what has actually changed of this conflict when we talk about the multipolar reality. One thing which has shifted is that the consultations, the negotiations came into the hands of the legitimate stakeholders of this region. Today, Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and China, they are trying their best for the efforts. We don't see any single hegemon and outsider from the Gulf states who are dictating and deciding the fate of the Arab states or the in West Asia. These are the real stakeholders who are actually suffering from this conflict. And if it is resolved or de-escalated, they will benefit as well, and as well as the rest of the region and the whole world will benefit. So I think this is one reality that now the real stakeholders are talking about resolving this conflict. Second, the China as a new emerging multipolar superpower has the sway and clout, especially when it comes to Iran. The only entity who could guarantee this talk is indeed China. When we talk about China's relations with Iran in terms of its strategic relations, in terms of its economic relations because of the Strait of Hormuz, and in terms of its military relations with Iran. So I think the only legitimate and sole guarantor could only be China. This is the second reality which emerged out of this conflict. And the third, only Pakistan could do it because it has time-tested relationship with China over the years. So Pakistan again was the right candidate to have its efforts and to convince China for its support and for its guarantee. Now, coming to your question, is that what sort of situation or the Strait of Hormuz is being announced that Iran will close it again. I think this is the right move on parts of Iran because what sort of options Iran is left with when it comes to have a pressure tactics. I think if Iran is doing that for now, it can have its double sword effects because this is one of the precondition for United States of America as well that they can have a talk only when the Strait of Hormuz is open. But at the same time, Iran has always also categorically said that for the precondition of the talks, Iran will open as a goodwill gesture. But where is that goodwill gesture when when it coming from the Netanyahu, the sort of mayhem which they have created in Lebanon today, the sort of repressive policies which it is carrying on in this region. The world has witnessed that what sort of barbaric and genocide has carried in Gaza. So I think these are some structural problems which must be resolved in order to have an enduring and long-lasting stability. But let's figure out for that moment that right now we need de-escalation in this region. And I think these structural problems can be discussed in phased manner later. But whether it will happen or not, it's a million-dollar question at the moment.
$1 million question, Mr. Abdulnoor. To me, maybe one last comment before we wrap up, and one last answer from your part. How can they perhaps, will there be escalation? Perhaps we're not seeing that yet. And also, in a minute, can they rebuild trust? They're going to meet for the first time directly again on Friday. Can trust can be rebuilt? Can it be rebuilt?
This is actually, it's a 40,000 question. So for the moment, it's very hard. I mean, at the moment we're speaking, but for the next hours or so, it has to be. So the trust, it's a virtuous characteristic. It's very hard to build up, but with the time it will come. But what is important is those talks need to take place. And again, one has to watch carefully the role of Pakistan, and the main guarantor of this is China. But one has to do not forget there is another superpower who is watching this carefully, is Russia, who is playing a major role also in this dynamic of negotiation, in which will lead to break through to a ceasefire, and that will lead to a permanent ceasefire for not only for Iran but for the entire region, to make an end for good for the fantasy of the Zionist entity prime minister who wants to destroy the region.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdel Noor Toumi, for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you also, Dr. Wasil Bourghul. You joined us live from Paris.
Thank you. Pleasure was all mine.
And thank you, Mr. Yassir Masoud. You joined us live from Beijing.
My pleasure.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you, dear viewers, for your kind attention, and see you in our next editions.